Say no.
Well, good morning, and warm welcome to all of you. Real privilege for me today to introduce our lecturer this morning, Christopher Seitz. Our community was blessed yesterday to hear him preach on Ecclesiastes 12, and today's lecture will press more deeply into Kohelet's wise counsel in the book. So we're also especially glad to have his wife Elizabeth with us this week. It's been great to reconnect with the two of them. I've latched on to a phrase that I heard many years ago from a Presbyterian friend of mine. We were navigating some issues in our local church, and he said to me, you know, all we can do sometimes in our lives is follow the parade of providence. And my wife and I last night were recounting the parade of providence in our own lives that led us to St. Andrews, Scotland many years ago. We weren't charting the course of our lives back then, 26-year-olds that we were, how could we? But now we see it as an act of gracious providence that allowed me to study under Professor Seitz back then. Little did I know then how shaping his influence would be on my life and my calling. I have really fond memories. I wish you all could have been flies on a wall of our cadre of students cramming every week into a small seminar room to wrestle together with the limitations of the historical critical legacy and the potential of reading scripture theologically, that is in conversation with the church's dogmatic and hermeneutical traditions. So many of us in that room were set on a life's quest to pursue these kinds of questions. I should say this, Professor Seitz is the kind of teacher who understands the classroom or the seminar room as a gymnasium or a weight room. It's not a therapist's couch. I'm going to embarrass him with this story, but I say it to encourage the students who are here or watching. It was my first semester at St. Andrews, and it happened to be American Thanksgiving. And Naomi and I, that night, were to have dinner with Professor Seitz and some other students. I had turned in my first writing sample to Professor Seitz, along with a kind of architectonic of my dissertation project. I doubt you even remember this. And on the morning of Thanksgiving, I found a brown A4 envelope in my box, and I opened it, and there was a typed cover letter, and then my writing sample with so much red on it that I couldn't even process what I was seeing. Now, Professor Seitz raised critical questions about the project. He clarified for me in the letter what the genre of a dissertation actually is. Apparently, I was misinformed. And he ended the letter by saying, I'll never forget reading this, I'm not sure this constitutes a PhD project in its current form. And I remember thinking, dinner's going to be great tonight. So no seminary professor of mine had ever engaged my work like that, and I remember thinking, well, big boy, welcome to the major leagues. So that process of, if I can borrow theological terms, of humiliation before exaltation, earning the degree, was so important, and I remain grateful. You know, the book of Hebrews tells us to honor our teachers, to honor those who delivered God's word to us, and I'm happy to honor one of mine here in this context where God has afforded me the opportunity to teach his word. So Professor Seitz, thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to hearing you this morning.
I'm going to start with a portion of scripture from the 28th chapter of Job. There's a mine for silver and a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth and copper is smelted from ore. Mortals put an end to the darkness. They search out the farthest recesses for ore in the blackest darkness. Far from human dwellings, they cut a shaft in places untouched by human feet. Far from other people, they dangle and sway. The earth from which food comes is transformed below as by fire. Lapis lazuli comes from its rocks, and its dust contains nuggets of gold. No bird of prey knows that hidden path. No falcon's ear has seen it. Proud beasts do not set foot on it, and no lion prowls there. People assault the flinty rock with their hands and lay bare the roots of the mountains. They tunnel through the rock. Their eyes see all its treasures. They search the sources of the rivers and bring hidden things to light. But where can wisdom be found? And where does understanding dwell? The book of Job asks where wisdom comes from, where it can be found. One can open a mine shaft and drill deep into the bowels of the earth, laying bare treasures and precious stones, all the more valuable because so hidden and so hard to extract. But wisdom is harder to find. One could say the same thing about the use of the term in biblical studies. Does it refer to an idea, a school, a profession, sages perhaps joining prophets and priests, a movement, a genre, or perhaps a distinct body of literature to be called wisdom literature? This would make the quest far simpler, one supposes. We have prophetic books, and we have Torah, the Pentateuch. Can we not therefore also speak of wisdom literature? Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes have been regular candidates for the category, joined for scholarly treatments at times by the Greek books of Sirach and the Wisdom of Solomon. One does not need to drill deep down into the earth to find this wisdom literature. There it is. All one must do is put the books in some kind of sequence. This would be a good modern example, John McLaughlin's Israel's Wisdom Traditions. Can we not also speak then of a wisdom literature? Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes have been regular candidates and often joined, as I said, by Ben Sira and the Wisdom of Solomon. A popular sequence in discussing wisdom literature is to speak of a movement from Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, in that order. Proverbs represents, as the theory goes, a coherent, a unified school wisdom centered on the two-sentence maxim. These are so familiar to us. One could land anywhere in the book of Proverbs and find the form here, a maxim, a proverb, quite literally speaking. The book of Job starts on this same terrain, but then, as the theory goes, we watch it come apart. So the beginning of the book of Job, often referred to as the folk tale. The Lord gave, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. Ecclesiastes is held to start with this same premise, but then it has dispensed with it altogether. It is a literature of pessimism without any kind of wisdom to be sought for. It cannot be found. The quest for it is doomed. Job should have known that from the beginning. We can call this the wisdom journey. It starts out promising, and then it ends in failure. Do not read Proverbs. It is simplistic and wrong. We are, of course, running past some obvious problems, for there is no canonical category, no arrangement in the final form of the literature for something to be called wisdom literature. And here the contrast with Torah and prophets is obvious. The Pentateuch is a carefully marked 5-book collection. The prophetic collection is a little more complicated. It consists of former and latter divisions. The second subdivision is familiar to us, just as are the 5 books of Moses. 3 major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book of the 12. You'll notice I have Daniel there as a question mark. We'll come back to that. One may pause and ask why there are these 2 different divisions under the same title, Nevi'im, prophets, since the first one, running from Joshua to 2 Kings, seems different in character than classical prophecy, or why Daniel will arrive to find its place alongside these writings, these prophets from time to time. But that's a simple question to answer compared with the invention of a tidy category called wisdom literature, now, which nowhere has any comparable canonical marking. These books are found in the miscellany or library section of the Hebrew canon, the Ketuvim, the writings, and they never appear in that order, that is the order of typical wisdom literature treatments. Rather, we have 2 kindred sequences, you'll see there in bold, which focus on what we will call the literature of Solomon, either Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs in One listing familiar from the tradition, and another one, Proverbs, Song, and Ecclesiastes. You'll note here that we haven't yet mentioned Song of Songs, since it doesn't often appear as a book of wisdom literature. Job is a big book, and it often appears, as you'll know from English Bible collections, as either the first or the second book, and it's usually ranged alongside the book of Psalms, which is about of equal length. The hero of the book of Job is not an Israelite, but a predecessor of Noah. We learn this from the book of Ezekiel. And the friends who come to comfort him are likewise pre-flood foreigners. Indeed, part of the dilemma of the book, here's a good example. Those are the books of Solomon, the two different orders. Part of the dilemma of reading Job is what to make of this foreign and pre-Torah context. You'll notice that the book really trades on a question: can a mortal serve God for nothing but God's own sake? This is the question that's put to Job at the beginning of the book. And this question is most poignant and challenging, given that it is delivered to a non-Israelite at the time of the flood and before the giving of the Torah. It makes it a challenge, a kind of generalizable challenge, in that it's sort of like the literature of the primeval parts of Genesis really addressed pre-election, that is, to sort of all of us, as it were. Luther said he'd like to describe this period where the patriarchs faced God in the term he used was Urgewalt, his sort of challenging and majestic power. El Shaddai, as the book of Job describes God. The only way to get Job to range along Proverbs and Ecclesiastes is to theorize, then, a wisdom literature in which it represents a kind of medial deconstructing phase. One needs a theory of historical, not canonical context that tells us we have a residual folktale in which a conservative proverbial wisdom is being then torn apart by the friends who come to comfort Job, waiting to enroll in the school of Ecclesiastes, as it were, a book contemporaneous with the dialogue parts of Job. That is, if you know the book of Job, that main part of the book running from chapter 3 up to the wisdom poem I just read. The wisdom of the prologue, however, in the final form of the book, is of a piece with the epilogue, and therefore has the first and the final word. Job's is a hard-fought but real struggle, and one of victory when you read the book in its final form, and not in this sort of staged developmental model that owes itself to the wisdom literature model. I think the book of James captures this well when it says, "You have heard of the hupomone of Job." It's not referring to the Job of the folktale and epilogue, but indeed the Job who perseveres, the Greek word meaning literally, who stands when others go away, who stands under something. That's another lecture. I think the word patience in the King James probably didn't do us any favors. You have heard of the patience of Job. It sounds like he just sat and shut his mouth, when in reality the Greek verb really is more like endured or persevered, and therefore that often now appears in modern translations. I wrote an essay on this some time ago. Marvin Pope used to say, "Oh, the book of James really only knows the Job of the epilogue and the prologue." I said, no, it doesn't. It's thinking of this long struggle that Job undergoes. Job's is a hard-fought, but real wisdom, as the final form of the book has it, instead of the way it is understood in the wisdom literature model. I'll come back to this point in a moment. I think the main thing to be noted is that we have no wisdom literature represented in the form it has come to be prioritized and popularized when we look at the canonical presentation itself. That is, this model, you start with Proverbs, you move to Job, then you move to Ecclesiastes, and then you sort of figure out what to do with Ben Sira and the wisdom of Solomon, because they look like they're actually going backwards. They're becoming more conventional, not more pessimistic. But this is very popular. I don't. Maybe Mark uses it here and gets into trouble. I don't know. But James Crenshaw, probably the most popular form of this particular model. Wisdom literature is part and parcel with the idea that the canonical orders are not themselves significant. I'll go back. That might be helpful to see the way this literature actually exists in the form of the canon. But as this idea begins to lose its grip on interpretation, Mark spoke of the legacy of historical criticism, that was one of the sort of chief components. As this idea loses its grip on interpretation, so does the invention of a category called wisdom literature and the dating schemes held to be of crucial interpretive importance. Nothing prevents a post-exilic author, say of Job, from laying hold of an antediluvian hero like Job and making him the centerpiece of his theological masterpiece, precisely as that same antediluvian hero, whose struggle is more intense and more meaningful on the terms the book itself gives it to us. I think of Shakespeare in the 16th century conjuring up King Lear from the 8th century and using him as a vehicle for a wise piece of literature. The most obvious thing, I think, to be noted in the canonical orders is the Triad of Books, as you see here on this slide. The broadly Jewish view of the Solomonic books is that the sequence represents an aging process. This is Rashi in the 11th century. King Solomon, having experienced both the world's glories and disappointments, wrote the book of Ecclesiastes in old age. Proverbs comes, on this view, from the king's classical education, Song of Songs from his libidinal heyday, and Ecclesiastes from old age and gray hair. This life journey is not a repudiation of the first and second phases of life, but a mature appreciation of them as death approaches. On one account, this is from the Targum of Koheleth, to which I'll return tomorrow, the author has lost his name, that is Ecclesiastes, and has been given a new one, Koheleth, on account of his sins, as recorded in the last chapters associated with him. You'll see here, it's a fascinating text. The bottom line there is the one I've put in bold. I am Koheleth, who was previously named Solomon. I was king over Israel. That was a sort of model I was working with a bit yesterday. This understanding of Solomon is clearly based on the biblical text, 1 Kings 11, 4-9. Solomon, at the end of his life, was faithless. He built idols, and he forgot the Lord. In the kind of summary there, you can see it. It's not a very happy ending to a otherwise, I think, as depicted in the text, fairly noble, although unusual career, Solomon. I think Solomon is an unusual figure. But the main point here is that Ecclesiastes shows us, in my view, and I'll talk about this tomorrow, a man who knows all of this to be so and who is contrite in a manner that will open deeper sources of wisdom than he has known in his earlier libidinal or educational heyday. In his loss of a name, he is further an Adam, not far from each and every one of us. And I'll show this hopefully tomorrow in his building project where he says, and I did this, and I did this, and lo, it was hevel, it was vanity. It sounds a lot like, and God created and so forth, and he saw that it was good. So it's a kind of play on that. I'll be talking about that tomorrow. The Christian idea, here's Origen, 2nd century, worked with a slightly different, you'll recall, it has a slightly different sequence. It goes from Proverbs to Ecclesiastes to Song of Songs. But both the Jewish and the Christian have this idea that these books are meant to be thought of as a triad. Proverbs, in this view, is classical education. You learn the strong verbs first. You get the driver's ed version for beginning to get behind the wheel. Ecclesiastes is real wisdom, exceptions to the rule. The weak verbs that, in point of fact, as we know from Hebrew and other languages, are different precisely because they're used more often in life, and so reflect experience and malleability. That's why we put them off in the grammar till the end. They're the most difficult because they're the ones used most often, whereas katal, to kill, doesn't even exist in the Hebrew Bible. Wisdom must negotiate the rule and the exception if it is to be wisdom. And having done that, according to Origen, this is really the quote here, one breaks into song. Why? For Origen, song is the language of heaven and eternity, for which we must be made fit by a wisdom not gained but endowed from on high. That's a slightly different model. I think they're complementary. Grasping that gives way to loss, that gives way to a new kind of open hand before God. One can see that though with a different sequence, the same basic wisdom is being imparted in the Jewish and the Christian traditional readings, and this is precisely because the books are being read together and not transferred to a kind of wisdom literature category where song falls out altogether and Job is, I would argue, misfitted in. There is a good reason for leaving that majestic book, Job, alone to do its own majestic thing. In its canonical form, it has its own journey. We are asked to take alongside the hero, and the brilliance of the book is that we know things Job does not know, and yet that knowledge cannot impede the titanic struggle Job must undertake if Satan's wager is to be defeated. The brilliance of the canonical form is ruined if the book is chopped into different pieces, developmental pieces, folktale dialogues, divine speech, and wisdom poem, so as to be placed inside the artificial framework of deteriorating wisdom, according to the wisdom literature model. The genius of the form is revealed precisely in its final present form. Job and the reader face different challenges under different conditions as we journey alongside our hero and watch him triumph through what the Epistle of James called hupomone, perseverance, standing when others leave. Friends, you recall, sputter out in Dialogue 3. Bildad, Zophar, Eliphaz, one of them doesn't even bother to show up. My intention in this lecture is to clear the ground for a fresh look at Ecclesiastes, if we can get a proper angle of vision from which to approach it. And here the wisdom idea, in my view, is a hindrance. But it might be useful to stop and ask how the notion took hold in the first place. It's easy enough to speak of a descent in confidence and wisdom. Anybody can dream this up. But how true is this to Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes? Think of Proverbs for a second. Go to the ant, thou sluggard. Always has the potential for the observer to learn nothing or pull out the bug spray. That's built into the problem that Proverbs itself is wrestling with. Proverbs is not a monochromatic, a stitch in time saves nine. Anybody who looks at it in its canonical form can see that it consists of varieties of forms. It contains its own tensions and seeming disagreements over what it commends. Does the wise man hold his tongue, or does the wise man stand up and speak? You can find both sentiments in the book of Proverbs. And so something is needed more than naked observation of the ways of the world. The fear of the Lord is ingredient in what it means to have wisdom's beginnings or outskirts, as it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And as we'll see in Koheleth, wisdom has a beginning, but it also has an end. The end of the matter, all has been heard, fear God and keep his commandments. That's a kind of bookend on these two works. If one looks at the roots of the idea of a distinctive wisdom literature, one will see the emphasis on Solomon prior to the mid-19th century. But matters of historical authorship began to weigh heavier at this period in time. You'll note in passing that the Greek books, Sirach and Wisdom of Solomon, 2nd century BC, they're written in Greek, already make any simple Solomon wrote the book by holding the pen idea inadequate. Gregory of Nyssa and all the early commentators in the tradition made note of the failure to actually name Solomon by name in the book as worthy of notice. This is from Didymus the Blind On his account, the lack of reference to Solomon explicitly, there's a kind of flirtation, I'll talk about this tomorrow, was to prevent us reading the book as primarily autobiography. Maybe we should opt for the latter so that nobody may say the speaker talks only about himself. There's something more going on here according to the early fathers. Didymus and Gregory of Nyssa wanted a larger dimension of significance to be available than autobiography. And again, I'll be talking about this tomorrow. The point is that the Solomonic association and the idea of a wisdom literature coalescing around it was sufficiently flexible to accommodate the demanding subject matter that any evaluation of wisdom demands. Thus far, I've been referring to a canonical arrangement or presentation that looks to an order going back to the relatively consistent Hebrew tradition: Torah, prophets, and writings, Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, as the lingo goes. Modern English printed Bibles, however, as you're doubtless more aware, follow a different order in which the classical prophets come last, Malachi, and the former prophets have been joined by historical books of like content from the writings. This is a typical modern English printed Bible. Again, that's another interesting topic. Where do we get this order? I think it comes from Luther's access to the Paris polyglot, because it doesn't exist anywhere. There's not an order of Christian or Jewish lists in which Malachi is the last, and yet that's the one that we're just reflexively familiar with. It's not a lot going on there. I just want to point that out. I'll be talking about this again or in more detail. This particular order that we have is fourfold, not threefold. Torah, historical books. You'll notice that Ruth has migrated from the writings to take its place between Judges and 1 Samuel. Lyrical books, and I put that in scare quotes because I just made the term up. I mean, it's not really, you can find it in the RSV and other things, but it's just, I'll say a little bit more about this. And prophets, the three, but now notice Lamentations and Daniel have migrated from the book of the 12, from the Ketuvim and the 12 minor prophets. The wise among you will note that I have made up this category, lyrical books, but I do so because that's the way English Bibles often put the matter. What this category really is, in my view, is all the books left over when the more historical books, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, have been extracted, or those more topically akin to friendly neighbors have been put right next to them. Daniel after Ezekiel, Lamentations following Jeremiah, and Ruth before Judges, although Ruth is a book that moves quite a lot. What remains after this exercise is a new division, if that's the right word for it: Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. If one looks to the lists that exist in Christian tradition, the Jewish is a bit more simple to follow. Prior to the convention of our modern English Bibles, a couple of things are immediately obvious. First, in these lists, surprisingly, you go to Lee MacDonald's big book on the canon, he's got them all helpfully laid out there. In these Christian lists, surprisingly, there is no fixed sequence, but rather lots of different sequences. No one seemed too exercised about this. Jerome, who was commissioned by the Pope to produce a single Hebrew verity, a Latin text with a single order, in time never defeated. I mean, Jerome did his work, but the tradition said, we don't like that. We're going to continue to do what we've been doing. The Gallican Psalter is a classic example of that. He worked hardest on the Psalter, but it never really gained any purchase on the Christian church. So first, there is no fixed sequence. Second, Malachi, the final book of the 12 minor prophets, is never last, sort of leaning into Matthew, John the Baptist, Elijah. That's a very nice little transition. It's just that Malachi never is the last book of the canon. You don't really need that in order to make that work. I don't think Matthew required it. I have my own views on it. I think Chronicles is probably the last book of the canon, and the genealogical interests of Chronicles matches up quite nicely with Matthew. Those among you, let them go up, and then immediately you've got Matthew there. That's just a speculation on my part. And thirdly, something like the Hebrew order, the tripartite, the threefold order, Torah, prophets, and writings, with books from the writings in final position, often appears in these Greek lists. Esther's usually last, or Daniel. The relative fixity of the Hebrew tripartite is not in evidence, but equally to the fourfold, with which we're familiar. This English printed Bible convention is absent. But what is preserved is the Solomon Triad, in both Hebrew and Greek, in modern orders too. But the one we are familiar with the lyrical book category, has them ranged with Psalms and Job. I think that probably those books are there in that order because they're the biggest of those 5 books. A second reality needs to be considered alongside this: how to organize a curriculum for students. We can see reference to the curriculum in Divinity from the 16th century at the University of St. Andrews. If you were studying there, you would study the Solomon books taught as a block. If you happened, like Mark Genelette, to have been studying there, that's what you would have done. There would have been, however, no wisdom literature. Now let's pivot to our present situation, because everybody has to have a curriculum in some order. And I'm going to assume this is the order you're familiar with. A modern curriculum for a seminary in which coverage of all the books of Old and New Testaments is a desired goal, the so-called survey course, has to make decisions about how to present the material and how best to distribute the lectures and readings. The entire New Testament is about 1/5 of the size of the Old Testament, and that means that New Testament colleagues, as usual, don't have to work as hard as their Hebrew Bible counterparts. Historically oriented New Testament survey courses typically do Paul in semester 1, Gospels and Acts in semester 2, and work in the Catholic epistles and Revelation in some manner. Old Testament survey courses deal with the Pentateuch and all the problems and complexities of J, E, D, and P. Maybe that'll die off. They may ponder whether Deuteronomy belongs with the books that follow, or the Pentateuch is better thought of as a hexateuch, including Joshua, or they may just glance at the idea and get on with the Torah first and the former prophets second. Here we see something of a congenial coming alongside of printed Bibles and classroom curriculum. The former prophets are, of course, historical in character and different in kind from the classical prophets, with which they have been conjoined in the Hebrew tradition under the rubric Nevi'im. Both are called Nevi'im, and they are distinct from Torah on one side and writings on the other. But in modern critical studies, the former prophets grouping comes nicely alongside the idea of a Deuteronomistic history being the key word here, a history beginning with Deuteronomy and ending with the fall of the monarchy, with sad episodes of the splitting of the destruction of the temple, but prior to that, the splitting of the kingdoms and so forth. So Pentateuch and Deuteronomistic history in semester 1, creation to exile, works out nicely. Torah and former prophets corresponding to parts 1 and 2 of English printed Bibles, with the former prophets representing a continuous historical record from Joshua to the return from exile and restoration, hinted at just a bit at the end of 2 Kings. Perhaps if you've got enough time in your schedule, your teacher will take you into Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Semester 2, you'll note, however, does not pick up with the next third division, lyrical books, but typically tackles the classical prophets. Rather like the letters of Paul, these are not treated in the order we find them, Hosea, so forth, starting with Hosea, but rather according to a reconstructed chronological sequence. The second prophet, Amos, he comes into frame usually and starts the sequence, followed by Hosea and Micah, portions of Isaiah spliced in, Jeremiah, and so forth and so on. Publishing houses come into their own here as introductions to the prophets alongside these lines, as self-contained works are easily packaged. Standard, historically oriented introductions to the Old Testament also cover this territory reasonably well. So far, so good. How many introductions to the prophets exist? Quite a lot of them. Blenkinsop, I could rattle off a few, Von Rad, and others. But notice what has been left out, given attention to historical unfolding and reconstructions of proper sequence. Section 3 of English printed Bibles has become stranded. The lyrical books, Proverbs, Psalms, Job, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. They just don't fit in well in the standard operating procedure. Obviously, they are important books and so deserve their own treatment. So the genre wisdom literature was born and textbooks got generated. You could give a whole lecture series on why publishing houses are actually a pretty major influence on the way curriculum design goes, and there's a kind of marriage of going back and forth on these things. If the curriculum changed, the textbooks would likely follow. These are important books. The genre wisdom literature was born. It's obviously not quite clear what to do with Psalms. There are wisdom Psalms. Maybe you toss a few of those in for good measure. What do you do with Song of Songs? Well, we didn't have time. It's kind of confusing. What does anybody make of this book? It's kind of odd, even though it's like the most popular book in the history of interpretation. Another factor is also clear. These are not books that fit easily into a chronological one thing after another model, which dominates in a typical introduction. Their proper interpretation doesn't turn on securing for them a historical context in the same way, though the wisdom literature model has tried mightily. The basic outlines of this textbook genre, as Will Kynes and others have noted, go back to the mid-19th century. It's not surprising, given the field's investment in historical approaches as the sole key to interpretation. But another factor has to be mentioned here. Questions were raised with high seriousness about whether and how Solomon might rightly be thought of as the author of the three books traditionally associated with him. Even the conservative flank, represented by Franz Delitzsch, famously said, "If Koheleth is not post-exilic, there is no history of the Hebrew language." That's a quote. Technical study of Hebrew had evolved to a point where much of the vocabulary found in Ecclesiastes, Greek loan words, and so forth and so on, gave evidence of a much later date than Solomon and the wisdom famously associated with him in the narratives of 1 Kings, that is, the era of David and the founding of the monarchy. As I said, a certain high seriousness accompanied this separation of Ecclesiastes from Solomon, forgetting, of course, that in the book itself, the association is already at one step removed. The name Solomon never appears, even as some kind of association does seem intended. I'll be talking about that tomorrow. As I said, the earliest pre-critical commentators noted this absence of direct reference to Solomon and considered its significance exegetically, without all the high-flying concern for authorship and dating and so forth, which preoccupied the 19th and 20th centuries. To summarize, one way of handling the wisdom books would have been to slot them alongside the context they themselves set forth. That is, treat the Solomon trio when one is dealing with 1 Kings. There, Solomon is the wise source of proverbial wisdom, the amorous king with enough wives to woo with Song of Songs like wooing, and the king who fell off the rails later in life. Job, we are told in the book of in Ezekiel, is a contemporary of the pre-flood Noah. This would help explain the book's strange aura. Its hero is pre-Israelite and non-Israelite, as are his friends. The divine name, as revealed to Moses, plays no role in the book, only twice mentioned in the prologue. Rather, we have the fearsome El Shaddai, and a climate Luther described as one in which God appears in his pre-law majesty, darkness, and power. It was above all the search for the proper historical location of an alleged author and audience which recalibrated the canonical context the books themselves ask us to read them in. Not Solomon, directly or more obliquely, not David and the Psalter, not Job and Noah, rather a post-exilic situation of wisdom in crisis for Ecclesiastes. Not a Job under trial on the terms the book presupposes, staring into an abyss of undeserved suffering. Rather, the book needed to be understood as an attack on the pious moralism of the opening two chapters, the proverbial, shall we not receive good as well as evil from the Lord. The Psalter detached from David, because we can no longer imagine him in Psalm 3 writing on the morning after he fled from Absalom. Tomorrow's lecture will present a different model for interpreting the book of Ecclesiastes. Our point for today is to note that the wisdom literature genre emerged for certain reasons related to dating books as crucial to their interpretations, on the one hand, and a failure to take seriously the canonical arrangements of the books, in which wisdom has no single genuine literary setting. The order of English printed Bibles, where 5 books, Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song, are what remains when historical books have been removed from the Ketuvim, does not create wisdom literature in the popular textbook versions. The Solomonic emphasis remains clear, as it does equally in the order of the Ketuvim, the writings. The argument could be made that attention is now being paid to the final forms of books, the Pentateuch, the former prophets, the latter prophets, even the book of the 12 minor prophets in the order in which we have them. This is a new trend in biblical studies. What I believe is needed is a better understanding then of the character of the writings. Instead of wisdom literature, we have a collection of writings that are, by definition, a miscellany, a library of books. Unlike the other divisions, where order and sequence are significant indexes for interpretation, this division is different. This would explain why the stability of ordering we note elsewhere gives way to 3 or 4 dominant patterns and not just one in the writings. As the individuality of the works is more prominent. I have argued that the reason for this is that the writings are composed with reference to books outside of their divisions. Genesis and Job, Psalms and David, Chronicles and Ezra, Nehemiah with Kings. In fact, Chronicles, you can argue, is a book that summarizes the entire canon from creation to Chronicles. Ruth and Judges, Lamentations and Jeremiah. Law has a source in Moses, praise in David, wisdom in Solomon. In the post-exilic period, attention, I think, manifestly returns to the past, where great founders are seen as the sources from which we mean by things like law and prayer and wisdom. This is less a historical claim than a theological and a hermeneutical one. To be a prayer in the proper sense is to live in the spirit of David. So to the general question then, whither wisdom? I sort of play on words there. Withering wisdom. Whither wisdom? One answer is a fresh, careful, thoughtful appreciation of the canonical division of the writings. Unfortunately, such work has been hindered at a number of points. One is the existence of different orders in most English printed Bibles, such that the very character of the third section is hard to evaluate as significant. I suspect that's true for all of us who are familiar basically with the canon in a certain fourfold form. A second is the consequence of an account of the development of the canon, in which we're asked to think of successive phases of closure. Torah first, then writings, and then finally the prophets, and then finally the writings. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Fortunately, we're now better poised to appreciate the way Torah and prophets are mutually influencing themselves in their formation and come to be what they are as different sections by collaboration, not this first and then that one. I think closure has been a highly misleading idea, imparted, I think, from the New Testament side and from conciliar decisions in the life of the church, which really play a very, very different role when it comes to the Old Testament. There were no closure councils, and indeed it's possible to speak of canon without majoring in fixed orders, limitation, scope. Let me wrap this up. I'm looking at the clock. I want to end then with a different way of sort of thinking about how we approach the writings, and therefore how we might re-ask questions about what we mean by wisdom. The Torah and the prophets divisions represents achievements of internal association. The books of the Ketuvim are not later or subsequent or unable to fit in. Some of them are manifestly earlier or contemporaneous with books in the other two divisions. The character of the writings is simply different. The writings, I think the name is quite right. As it is written, the writings, the graphe, it's by definition a sort of general term than Torah and prophets. These books are more independent of one another inside their division and more organically related to books outside of their division. This makes the Ketuvim different than Torah and prophets. The association of 3 Solomon books with each other can take 2 different forms, one in Jewish and one in Christian reception. And indeed, those of you who know, there's even a third possibility, and that is to arrange all the small books into a liturgical sequence focused on Passover, the Feast of Weeks, the destruction of the temple, the Feast of Booths, that's Ecclesiastes, right? Sit in your booth, contemplate the end of your life, and drink a glass of wine. I mean, that's the Feast of Booths. Remember that God is gracious and good, your life will come to an end. You can see how these associations would get made. To conclude then, the Ketuvim is a distinctive category. In the history of interpretation, we see the books capable of migration and reordering in a way that marks them off over against the Torah and the prophets. Probably with good reason. When the New Testament refers to the Old Testament, it speaks of the law and the prophets. I mean, it's a kind of grammar of the Old Testament. In my view, the writings could have 2 more books or 2 less books. It wouldn't really much matter. It's true to their character. There again, that's where closure, it seems to me, is the wrong idea. It's the kind of core grammar of the Old Testament, law and prophets, and then there's a miscellany of books that relate to them, fill them out. They're sort of midrashes on the earlier books. This is consistent with their associative and miscellaneous character. Good treatments of the writings will not focus on an original order, but will try to figure out and understand and appreciate why different orders have emerged in time. Let me choose one example. You'll know that Proverbs 31, that's a favorite text among evangelicals. You know, the ideal wife, who can find one? Who is the ideal wife who can find one? Just ask Boaz. I mean, in other words, that term, Eshet Hayil, appears at the end of Proverbs 31, and Boaz says, I found an Eshet Hayil, I found Ruth. So it's clear that there's something going on in that association. On the other hand, the place that we may be familiar with, where Ruth is between Judges and 1 Samuel, had also totally explicable. What's the end of Judges? Every man did what was right in their own eyes. There's no king in the land. Well, there's going to be a king. At the end of Ruth, there's a genealogy. It leads up to David. And in 1 Samuel, we have the Song of Hannah. So you can see that these books have migrated. But I think in order to appreciate their character, you have to have a starting place. You have to sort of think about what they're doing and why it is that they're capable of moving in ways that are different. And I think if this is in place, we can return to the Solomonic trio, which was preserved in these older orders. So tomorrow I will look, having set up this at Koheleth specifically, against the backdrop of hopefully a different model for interpreting Whither wisdom. Thank you for your attention.
Chris, are you okay taking fielding some?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
We have about 10 minutes.
Oh, good.
And we'll keep this somewhat informal, so feel free to ask questions. And Chris, for the sake of those who are listening, if you don't mind repeating the question, that'll help.
Will do.
I'll just open the floor.
I don't do PowerPoint, I'll have to admit, so I'm proud of myself. I got through that. I'm a bit old-fashioned. You saw how sexy it was, all the pictures and everything. I was really, when I worked with my own graduate students, I say, well, you have to do a presentation on Zoom. And I go, oh my God, that's really good. I can't do that.
The white remote. I was going to turn that.
Okay. Yeah, any hopefully, how about a softball?
I'll dive in with 2 softballs.
Okay.
First question is, and I probably should have told you this before you came, Professor Seitz, so I apologize. Our curriculum here in Old Testament is a bit different. So we do 1 semester of Old Testament theology, which is basically our survey class. Paul is takes the lead on this, Paul House. I pinch hit every once in a while. And then we do 4 semesters of kind of a deep dive into language. So 2 semesters of grammar, 2 semesters of exegesis. So that's how we go. Given what you have here, I'm just thinking pedagogically out loud. 1 semester survey. How might we reconfigure how we go about this so that we can link in these latter writings books in the sort of natural warp and move of the Torah and the Nevi'im?
Well, if the question suggests, for example, well, first of all, the obvious question any teacher asks, is it Paul or yourself, is, how much time do I have? And, one of the PhD students at Toronto are asked to actually mock up course syllabi. It's probably not a bad exercise, although I think it's seems like they could be doing something else. But anytime that you think about plotting a curriculum, you're obviously wondering, do I have to cover all the material? The British have sort of given up on that. They sort of do samples of things. I know it's Walter Moberly. That's why his books take the form that they do. If I felt as though, the easiest way to answer the question is, since the Ketuvim are a miscellany, it allows subtraction of them for the purposes of illustration. That's easier to do. You can say, hey, let me tell you about how Ruth is Ruth and how Ruth moves. That would be one example. You could say, I think reading Job out of a post-exilic context, because that's where we posit its author, it limits our ability to understand what's going on in the book. And, and then say, go and do likewise in the other books of the Ketuvim. But I suppose I gave the sort of classical model as I tend to think of it, partly because I was trying to figure out why wisdom literature arose as a textbook. And I think that is to do a bit with the issues I raised, that once you've set the thing up in this way, you're kind of wondering at the end of the term, what am I going to do with these lyrical books? And so you have something called wisdom literature that emerges. And Will know, who's here, Will Kynes. The attack on wisdom literature as a topic it's in the field now. This is not me. It's pretty much, I think, very hard to think that model has much left to go for it. Different people deliver different funeral speeches. Craig Bartholomew quite firm. It's over. Others maybe more gently. So if that's the case, I personally don't think just finding wisdom everywhere is the solution to the problem. I'd rather say, well, let's try to appreciate the character of the place in the canon where they exist. Yeah, is this Paul?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thanks for backing me up on several points in that class. Thanks for backing me up in several points in class. Don't you think the writings, particularly in a curriculum, and this is relevant because they'll be doing curriculum for churches and so forth. They have to think these things through, so this is great what you're asking. Those books that are movable are actually, and to Mark's question, most of our students have never read the Old Testament, the whole Old Testament. I certainly don't expect it. So you can understand Ruth why, because you've read Judges, you can read Ruth alongside it, but by the time you get to the writings, you can actually understand those books better because of what you've read before.
Yeah.
Do you think that's part of it?
Yeah, I actually think that's probably true to the reason, true to the tripartite. That is, you get acquainted with the first things, and then you can understand the shifts that are being. The third group relies on some intertextuals, the word that's in vogue, but it's aware of itself as proto-midrashic, might even be possible. Job is an interesting case. I sort of have the view that in the post-exilic period, people are searching about, trying to understand the present on the basis of often something quite deep in the history of Israel. And so Job emerges. The folk tale, I think when Ezekiel refers to Daniel and Noah and Job as preeminent in prayer. That's the thing, that they could probably pray the city out of doom, but you can't do it, Ezekiel. That prayer prayerful Job is the Job of the prologue. I mean, it's pretty clear. That's what's Job. He's so righteous, he gets up every morning and prays for his sons in case they might inadvertently sin. So there's a taproot there that's in Ezekiel, but I think it's an occasion for an exploration of a thing. And that's my sense of what's going on with Solomon and Koheleth. But I'm glad I backed you up.
Thanks so much for this. Glad to hear that we're moving on from wisdom literature. And I wonder if you could clarify, you put up a new alternative where you were connecting different books from the writings with other books. It seemed to me like you were primarily, the mode you are using is the historical context in which the book it kind of imagines itself, right? Job with Genesis and Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs with Solomon. But that's just, are you suggesting that is just one way we can do this? That actually because of the nature of the writings where all the texts are idiosyncratic, we could do all kinds of connections between the writings and other texts in the earlier sections?
I think there are limits to, I don't think Ruth is meant to be read with, Isaiah or something like that. I mean, some of these things are pretty obvious. I was noting that it may be that in their character, they tend to each one has to be differently evaluated. I mean, the Psalter's meant to be read in relationship to David, that there are Psalms of Asaph, Korah, Etan, Haman, and Solomon it doesn't do any, or that it says the Psalms of David, the son of Jesse, are ended, in some ways it's still the dominant lens. The superscripting of the Psalms, as you know, the longer ones, Childs is evaluated. I think the interesting thing there to note is that process continued in the Septuagint, which suggests that there's an activity of association that is begun in the texts, the Psalms that we're familiar with. I think the 13 with the longer, when David fled from Absalom, or when he feigned madness before, it should be Achish, but it's Ahimelech. In the Septuagint, that process continues. So there seems to be, Childs called it a pious study of Scripture, where an effort is being made to think about prayer by associating Psalms with episodes in the life of David. And I think, that's a kind of unique to what the Psalter's doing, and would limit, I think, how far we're meant to think of the malleability or flexibility. Ruth, maybe, a little more range. Is that?
Yeah, well, I just wonder, I think there are certainly limits. We're limited by the nature of the text themselves, but I wonder if they create other connections, like Proverbs alludes to Deuteronomy, and once we start to think about the instructional nature of both books, that becomes generative for understanding of both of them. I would argue Job is drawing on retributive ideas from Deuteronomy as well. So are we only limited to where they put themselves in the history of Israel and the world before Israel?
No, the case with Proverbs is quite interesting, because as you know, the epilogue of Koheleth, fear God and keep his commandments, sounds, and this is Gerald Wilson's point, like something we're getting in Ben Sira, where obedience to Torah is wisdom. And in Proverbs, obedience is to the teacher. It tends to function on commandments, but there's something going on where those things are beginning to attract one another. That it's obedience to Torah that constitutes real wisdom. And so that's right. One has to think about that. And I think Wilson's work on that's better than Jerry Shepard's on the epilogue, where he's trying to understand what the use of that phrase is to do with in Koheleth, which is typically taken away because it doesn't sound like Koheleth, that kind of thing. Koheleth would never say that, fear God and keep his commandments. But of course he does say it in the body of the book. He will bring everything into light. That's a Koheleth idea. You've been very patient. Yeah.
Any students, I'm mindful, any students want to ask a question before we head out? Ask a question back to that. Yep, one, and then this will be our last question.
Okay.
So you mentioned briefly about how the New Testament talks about law and prophets as kind of the main division of the Old Testament. Can you talk maybe a little bit more about how the New Testament as a whole kind of uses or speaks to these writings specifically, or does not speak to these writings specifically, and kind of what the significance of that might be?
Yeah, there's a technical question behind this, and that is when the New Testament says the law and the prophets, does it mean the first two divisions, or does it mean the law and the prophets is the sort of way we think about everything that's there? And there's a technical question here. Obviously, at the end of Luke, it says the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. And some people take that to mean that when the New Testament refers to the law and prophets, they only mean the first two divisions. I don't take that view in large measure because the New Testament is quite happily quoting the Psalter, for example, all the time. Oh, yeah, that's not in the law and the prophets. What are they doing? So I think there it's just a sort of flexible term for the totality. And there are technical studies on this when it says all the martyrs from Abel to Zechariah, A to Z. That works out nicely in English. A to Z. Some people think that Zechariah is the Zechariah Chronicles, which would suggest, because it's not the Zechariah, there's no martyred Zechariah the prophet. That means from Genesis to Chronicles. That's Beckwith's view. But he would say that's also the law and the prophets. I don't know if that's, behind that is, I didn't want to mislead. I only meant that law and the prophets is the shorthand way the New Testament refers to the Old Testament.
Great. Chris, thank you. We look forward to tomorrow.